Hello, and welcome to The Global Current, where Seton Hall's diplomacy students give you a fresh look at what's new around the world. I'm Karina Taylor.
And I'm Alex Krause.
In news this week,
20 people killed in recent shellings between Pakistan and India in Kashmir.
Sweden scanning its waters for a possibly Russian submarine. In analysis,
Ebola brings gaps in the third world healthcare to light.
The Energize Africa Act conveys American interest in African infrastructure.
This week we interview Dr. Martin Edwards on his experience with the UN.
Thanks for tuning in and enjoy the show.
And now, Lucy Jaguna recounts clashes between India and Pakistan in Kashmir.
In current news from Reuters, India had issued warning statements at Pakistan after alleged violations to a ceasefire concerning the region of Kashmir. India and Pakistan had previously exchanged mortars and intense gunfire throughout the month, contributing to the death of 30 civilians and leaving dozens more wounded. This has been said to be one of the worst ceasefire violations since 2003, with tensions remaining high as the belligerence continues. As reported by the Daily Times, India had been asked to accept the reality of Kashmir's dire living conditions. The visit of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi to the disputed state in Diwali indicated that the upcoming visit was more of a publicity stunt than a genuine desire to help the people. On his proposed visit, conference chairman Mirwais the Hurriyat had stated that instead of simply declaring tactics, it would be better for India's leadership to accept that Kashmir is a reality that needs to be solved. On international level, a march had been organized in London to highlight the ongoing crisis in Kashmir. Chief Minister Omar Abdallah condemned the organizers of the march, claiming that they should hold the event in the Valley of Kashmir instead of the cozy capitals of the United Kingdoms and the US. He also claimed that such rallies should be organized by individuals living in Kashmir, individuals who are in tune with the people of the region genuinely need. World Post News claims that the clashes in Kashmir between India and Pakistan are the worst in the years. Both countries place the blame on each other for starting their violent revolts. Even though both governments had said they wanted to improve the ties and eventually resolve the conflict, an instance of this was when the Indian Prime Minister had invited the Pakistan leader, Nawaz Sharif, to attend his inauguration ceremony. This was seen as a hopeful sign of promising cooperation between the two governments, and yet, months later, the artificial peace crumbles and the pressure of recent hostilities. According to The Telegraph, on the history of Kashmir, the region was under the leadership of a Hindu emperor, with the majorities of the population being Islamic. Hence the confusion between approving Indian or Pakistan occupancy of the area. Kashmir became an independent region after the United Kingdom divided its former colony into the current states of India and Pakistan, with both countries attempting to claim individual ownership of the zone. The first war took place in 1947, with India and Pakistan forcing their way into Kashmir. Since then, the conflict has continued with an inconclusive ending. This is Lucy Jaguna reporting for Global Current.
Karina Hendren reports on potential Russian incursions into Swedish waters.
On Friday, October 17th, the Swedish military revealed that they were investigating reports of foreign underwater activity in the Stockholm archipelago. It gained a lot of attention because it is reminiscent of various Soviet submarine sightings in Swedish waters throughout the Cold War in the 1980s. The Associated Press reported that there are suspicions of Russian intentions towards other states because of their intervention in Ukraine this year. According to Magnus Nordman, who is the deputy director of the Brent Sowcroft Center, it's one more data point in a larger pattern. Over the past 3 years, and especially in the last year, the Russians have made more and more incursions into Swedish airspace. There have been close calls between their ships, too. On the other hand, Konstantin Sivkov, who was a naval officer for the Soviet Union, stated that surveillance in foreign waters was the normal practice of many navies, but that it was very unlikely that a Russian submarine was currently in Swedish waters. On Sunday, the Russian Defense Ministry denied all reports of having a submarine in Swedish waters, but according to the BBC, a local newspaper in Sweden claimed that a Russian distress signal was intercepted by the Swedish Navy. On Wednesday, Rear Admiral Anders Grenstad told the BBC that if a submarine was discovered, force would be used to make it surface, and that the Swedish Navy is now focused on gathering intelligence. Elias Grohl wrote an article for Foreign Policy in which he discussed how Sweden lacks the infrastructure to properly track down whatever it is in their waters. He wrote on Monday, October 20th, Sweden's fleet of anti-submarine helicopters were phased out in 2008, and the replacement isn't expected until 2018. He also discusses how their military spending has gone down sufficiently within the past 20 years. As a result of this situation, Swedish Prime Minister Stefan Löfven announced that on Thursday the government will increase spending on defense.
What we're trying to do is to get over the probably a submarine, to really see, yes, it is underwater operation going on in our waters. I have no clue what kind of country that is behind this, and we can all speculate, but where we are working with it right now, we are not speculating. We are trying to gather more information.
This occurrence has also provoked discourse in some of the Nordic countries regarding incentives to join NATO. Time.com reports that according to Harry Mikkola, a global security researcher at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, if the vessel belongs to Russia, it will increase the incentive to join NATO, as well as increase the cooperation between the Swedish and Finnish militaries. Even though Sweden is not a member of NATO, the Swedes have been very close allies with NATO and have contributed to NATO efforts in places such as Afghanistan and Libya. This is Karina Hendren for the Global Current.
Ryan Sullivan discusses the cracks in third world healthcare revealed by Ebola.
The reaction by the international community to the recent outbreak of Ebola throughout West Africa has been surprising to some. However, the current response to an African crisis fits a common theme. International actors react by sending mass caches of aid and finances to target the latest crisis that underdeveloped regions are facing. Often, after the international community donates immediate aid in these instances, its attention is quickly taken elsewhere. Countries who provide aid often do so as a result of political incentive. Very few countries, if any, would be willing to expose its citizens to a potential hazardous situation and donate an unknown amount of resources to a seemingly uncontrollable cause. These countries' governments act independently from their populace only when national interests are threatened, much like President Obama's decision to conduct airstrikes in Syria and Iraq this year. Countries who engage in humanitarian relief provide enormous amounts of resources, especially in cases in underdeveloped areas, specifically Africa. Aid focused on specific problems do provide much relief, but there is an alternative solution, one that may be more expensive at the forefront but could save countless lives and unimaginable amounts of resources in the long run. The creation of an intergovernmental organization, such as an organ to the United Nations or the World Health Organization, specifically targeted at improving the infrastructure capacity and funding of public health sectors, would help prevent local issues from becoming full-scale continent-wide pandemics. This concept is an ambitious plan that would ensure the vulnerable countries have the capacity to take immediate and comprehensive measures at the first sign of a threat to public health. Right now, vulnerable nations such as the one currently battling Ebola lack the institutions to fully provide adequate care for their own citizens and are once again subjected to the dependency on foreign aid from international actors. In past cases, the global community has come together and vowed to never let catastrophes of a large-scale caliber to ever again. The field of infectious diseases is no different in this case. In 2003, the world responded to the SARS, or Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, pandemic in Asia, with a culmination of financial aid and resources that was injected into the area to meet the crisis, while the international community promptly stated that we must not allow something like this to ever happen again. Several nations began to place more investment in public health aid, but did not reach the necessary extent in which to ensure significant change. As quickly as the world acts to situations like the one just described, just as quickly as the international community seems to forget its preemptive objective. Kiji Fukuda, a senior official at the World Health Organization, spoke on this issue at George Washington University, as reported by the Washington Post, stating, "We go through an emergency. There's a great deal of attention. There's a lot of words about how important it is, and then it tends to evaporate. There is no question that necessary programs to make a significant change do not come cheap. The real question for the international community is at what price can we have regions of the world with lacking or non-existent public health institutions develop the necessary tools to fight epidemics? This is a crucial problem to solve, especially at a time when globalization is on the rise and where any person can get onto a plane and have the potential to spread a highly contagious pathogen from one side of the world to the other in just mere hours." Gail Smith, Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Development and Democracy, spoke to the Washington Post in regards to this current issue of Ebola, stating the following: "This Ebola epidemic is the most stark notification the world has been given that all of us are vulnerable if all of us are not prepared." The Washington Post also reported that the lack of coordination between participating states was so apparent that mass shipments of aid and funds would not be able to reach those in need for months after they have been requested. An aid worker with Médecins Sans Frontières, or Doctors Without Borders, spoke on the premise that the ongoing situation is much larger than Ebola.
Has turned and they are now afraid They are asking for help. They don't know how to respond to this, because if they call the hotline, nobody will come and pick them up because the system is completely overstretched. There are too many and the response is too weak. Hospitals are closed, clinics are closed, some of them have reopened.
One colloquial phrase that is often used in sport is, "We are only as strong as the weakest link in our chain." This then can be used just as well in the world of infectious diseases today. Countries have to trust that travelers from other areas have the proper medical attention in their own country to ensure that they are not traveling with a possible infectious disease within their system. Just because country X has the best healthcare system in the world does not make it invincible to an individual from country Y who doesn't have a resourceful healthcare system, entering country X as a vacationer and infecting countless number of civilians. The nature of global health is one that is based on teamwork and cooperation, especially between governments. Through advancements in technology and mobility, there are many more vectors of transmission by which these pathogens can jump from country to country. By enhancing the public health care system, these nations will be able to respond immediately and will no longer have to wait for the international community to finally heed the calls of these undeveloped states. As we saw in the latest crisis, the first cases of Ebola were confirmed on March 22nd in Guinea, and 1 week later, on April 1st, Médecins Sans Frontières warns the epidemic spread is unprecedented. On September 2nd, nearly 5 months after the warnings, the president of MSF criticized the United Nations members for its global inaction. These states within the region are reliant on the funding of aid in order to support its own people. Former Secretary General of the United Nations Kofi Annan spoke with BBC Newsnight, sharing some of his disappointment with the reaction of the international community to the latest outbreak of Ebola. In this interview, Mr. Annan spoke in protest of the idea that some Western states have proposed in sealing off West Africa and keeping the region contained. Mr. Annan strongly resented such a move, as he states here.
Basically what they are saying is, let's seal them off and let them die. If you don't fly and you cut off contacts, how do you get in health workers? How do you get in protective gears? How do you get in medication? Unless your decision is to condemn them to death from Ebola.
In regards to his biggest fear for the epidemic, he had the following to say.
Many more people will die, and it's also going to have a very negative impact on the economies of these countries and perhaps even beyond.
The moderator asked, what about the concerns of a worldwide epidemic? Mr. Annan stated that it was an overreaction in regards to the way that diseases spread, as it infects only through the contact of bodily fluids. These comments by former Secretary General Annan supported the need for further investment in the public health systems of the affected regions to ensure full capacity in taking care of infected citizens, as well as in preventing infectious diseases from scaling the globe. If the international community takes collective action to ensure these precautions and preventive measures, they will be addressing the weakest link in the chain of global public health. This is Ryan Sullivan reporting for the Global Current.
Bjorn Schwarzenbach analyzes how the Energize Africa Act reveals America's investment in African infrastructure.
The Energize Africa Act, currently in the U.S. Senate as Bill S-2508, is a new type of U.S. foreign aid in which private investment, non-governmental participation, along with U.S. government support, is funneled directly into alleviating energy poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. Energy poverty, as defined by the International Energy Agency, is a lack of modern energy services, such as household and commercial energy and clean cooking facilities. While most in the developed world take reliable energy sources for granted, the effect of energy poverty on daily life in sub-Saharan Africa is devastating. While most in the developed world take reliable energy sources for granted, the effect of energy poverty on daily life in sub-Saharan Africa is devastating. Not only are ordinary citizens negatively affected, but any long-term development projects in the economic or public sectors lie unrealized due to energy poverty. With the passing of the House version of the Energize Africa Act in May 2014, the Senate bill was introduced this past June to the Senate's Committee on Foreign Relations by New Jersey's Senator Menendez. This legislation came after President Obama's announcement of his Power Africa initiative back in mid-2013, in which he called for a new approach towards international development, an approach that was rooted in partnerships and would leverage private sector investment. In his speech to students at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, President Obama spoke of America's investment in the African continent.
Partnership with African nations, we're going to develop new sources of energy. We'll reach more households, not just in cities, but in villages and on farms. We'll expand access for those who live currently off the power grid.
The Energize Africa legislation also came after the highly reported on U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit held in early August of this year, in which many thought that this was to be President Obama's only crowning achievement regarding Africa. This event, many highlighted, only took place 5 years into his two-term, 8-year presidency. With an African policy legacy of huge proportions, former President Bush had definitely shadowed President Obama's lack of engagement with the continent by starting programs such as PEPFAR, a 2003 program fighting HIV/AIDS, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, a good governance institution. Along with August's African Leaders Summit, President Obama hopes to reinvigorate his African legacy with this attempt to alleviate energy poverty. The One Campaign, an international advocacy organization dedicated to alleviating extreme poverty in the developing world, outlined several key ways the lack of energy impacts life in sub-Saharan Africa. One main effect of energy poverty is poor health care. With 30% of health facilities without electricity, life-saving vaccines and drugs cannot be stored, and even with the best medical equipment, the utility of these medicines are nullified. Another effect energy poverty has is that it suppresses economic growth. Economic production on a power grid that is unreliable can be daunting for any company, large or small. Add this negative effect to businesses that work without an existing power grid, and one can only imagine the lack of productivity and production possible. The link between education and lack of energy is also clear, as energy poverty induces limited or no education. Along with this fact, 90 million children in sub-Saharan Africa attend a school that lacks some sort of electricity, and with this deprivation, students either spend time reading in the dark or spending hours gathering food sources on a daily basis. As the United Nations has previously stated, clear linkages between reliable energy and the Millennium Development Goals exist. The first goal reads, reducing extreme poverty and hunger. Any efforts in achieving this goal by next year needs to address the foundational nature of energy and the negative effect of energy poverty on development. The Energize Africa Act is a new, innovative, and smart foreign aid legislation that can really change how development is enacted. Not only does the bill address the important issue of energy poverty in the developing world, but it also capitalizes private investment along with public partnerships. With the called for creation of an African Power Advisor Group and a multi-year policy strategy, Sub-Saharan Africa can see an increase of at least 20,000 megawatts in electrical power, along with first-time access for at least 50 million people in its future. In addition, the bill's use of smaller, more independent U.S. development and financial institutions, such as the Overseas Private Investment Corporation and the Millennium Challenge Corporation, will in actual fact even save $86 million US from 2014 to 2019. The Energize Africa Act is one example of a comprehensive solution to extreme poverty that should be passed by the Senate and implemented by the U.S., and that can have a sustainable, long-lasting effect on the African continent. This is Bjorn Schwartzmark reporting for the Global Current.
Dr. Martin Edwards is an associate professor at the School of Diplomacy and International Relations and the director of the Center for United Nations and Global Governance Studies. He is an expert in the fields of international organizations and international political economy. And recently, he is the faculty advisor for the newly founded United Nations Association of the USA chapter at Seton Hall. Dr. Edwards, thank you for taking your time for this interview.
Oh, thanks, Daniel. Always happy to help.
All right, well, welcome. What does some of your past and current work entail?
I guess when you think about, like, research for academics, sort of the coin of the realm are peer-reviewed articles. So I've written on kind of three broad topics. First, the issue about why states join international organizations in the first place, and I've looked at that through not just state decisions to join the UN Commission on Human Rights when it existed, but also entering into agreements with the IMF. I've also looked at the issues of when we think about, do international organizations have effects? How do we know, and how can we estimate those, and what do they look like? And I focused largely on research on the IMF and the effects of IMF programs on capital inflows. And then the last piece of this, sort of historically, has been looking at public opinion, both on sort of globalization more generally, but also what determines public opinions cross-nationally about the international economic organizations.
And along those questions or these topics that you study, more broadly, what is it about international institutions that interested you in the first place?
Oh, that's a good question. I think when I was in high school, I was always really interested in international cooperation. And I was also sort of growing up at a time where there wasn't a whole lot of it. Politicians were talking about nuclear war being winnable. The relations in the U.S. and the Soviet Union were largely frozen. And so for me, it was just sort of a puzzle. It's like, well, why isn't there more cooperation? And sort of the older I got, the more it became apparent that international organizations are sort of the mechanisms by which cooperation happens when it happens globally. It's like what the embodiment of any cooperation between countries is a treaty, and very often there needs to be some sort of central body that's formed to monitor that treaty and interpret it, thus international organizations. So it sort of grew out of this just as a young kid, just being really interested in how cooperation works, and the hopes that we would be able to create more of it.
And your work at the School of Diplomacy, now there's a newly established Center for United Nations and Global Governance Studies. What are the aims of that center?
Well, at a lot of universities, the idea is that research centers are sort of places where we figure out how to pool our efforts into addressing certain types of problems. And so basically what we want to do with the center are two things. We want to be able to provide some sort of infrastructure for academic research. And so the vehicle right now that we have is this blog called The Permanent Observer. And so I've gotten a lot of past and present students to write, contribute columns, because obviously once you create a blog, then then the issue comes, okay, well, we need content. So it's been a nice vehicle for them, and then I'm obviously going to be opening it up to a lot of more current students and graduate and undergraduate at some point. So moving down the road, I think it's not our own possibility that we'll be trying to create working groups with students and faculty to sort of say, okay, look, here's a global problem. Let's figure out how to research it, and let's figure out how to write something on it. So that's one piece of this, is scholarship. And the second piece is going to be programming. Very often, centers are vehicles for programming, where you bring people in and have talks. I've already brought one alum in to give a talk, and I'm going to bring one in next Monday. And so this is obviously something we hope to deepen as well as we move forward.
Now we're going to get your opinions on a couple of things pertaining to the United Nations and other international organizations. Many people in America believe that the UN is a toothless tiger, and some are also afraid of the UN as a precursor to some sort of world state. In your opinion, is the UN weak or strong?
Well, I always find the people that are worried about the UN being a vehicle for stepping on U.S. sovereignty, I always find those folks to be really sort of intellectually interesting, but also they're profoundly misinformed. The U.S. enters into agreements of its own volition. We are not dragged into agreements. We are not compelled into agreements. So there's sort of this issue about responsibility that often that conspiratorial mindset sort of puts aside. You saw this in discussions about the Convention on Rights of Disabled Persons and on the Arms Trade Treaty as of late. It was like, if you really look at these agreements dispassionately, you see that no, they're actually safeguards built in by states by design, so that it doesn't step on the Second Amendment, and it's easy to scare people. I mean, to me, that you can think about sort of the influence of the UN in a couple of different areas. Where great powers have strong preferences, they're going to ensure their preferred outcomes, and the role of the UN is going to be smaller. So if we look at sort of global, the response to the global economic crisis, that was an IMF, G20-driven activity, because those were all major powers. The UN was sort of sidelined there. Peace and security, there's obviously a profound role, but again, it varies. It depends on what can get through the Security Council. So we can We can talk about Libya, but then obviously when we talk about Syria, there's obviously a whole lot more work to be done. With human rights, it's obvious that the UN has a huge role in just creating a language to talk about human rights that didn't exist in the 1940s. So in many of these cases, I guess if we ask the question, we can ask the question this way: if the UN never existed, we would still find ourselves wanting to create it, because it's the only game in town, and it is a vehicle for solving global problems.
In a way, do you believe that international organizations, their creation, their existence was inevitable?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that we have problems that cross borders. We need to solve these problems that cross borders. And so what we need are rules that need to be negotiated, right? And in a sense, creating a bureaucracy to help solve those problems is a whole lot more efficient than renegotiating treaties bilaterally every year. So absolutely.
Next, opinion question, I suppose. Around the world, do you believe that the UN is taken seriously despite its landmark resolutions, peacekeeping missions, and aid dispersed throughout the world?
Oh yeah, I think it's easy to look at the sort of the small things, right? The sort of the small failings about a peacekeeping mission that doesn't quite meet its mandate. But if you look at the big picture, that there's a reason why we are thinking about Ebola now as something that needs to be a UN-led operation. The international community turns to the UN to solve a lot of these problems. And, we can think about this in, peacekeeping as well. The reason why, the UN is involved in peacekeeping is because, what would the alternative be? Who's going to step up? The folks that work for DPKO are passionate about this, and they're not afraid to say, we're going to go to the Central African Republic because no one else is going to go. And that's a testament to the influence that the UN has.
Okay, and lastly, the students at Seton Hall recently founded a campus chapter for UNA USA, and you have been selected as the faculty advisor. With several hundred chapters across the country and organizations like UNA USA in other countries, do you believe that is the youth, that it is through the youth that the agenda of the UN can be realized?
I think that the UN has done so much work to try to explain what it does. And UNA USA is obviously an organization designed to explain what the UN does. And there are so many issues now that are directly relevant to youth. Post-2015, climate change. So right now is the perfect opportunity for folks to get involved and to sort of understand, okay, what does this organization do? What are they trying to do? And how can I help it? I mean, I guess a colleague of mine put it this way, in a sense. He said that my generation is the one that screwed large parts of this planet up, and it's going to fall to your generation to fix a lot of these problems. Notice I'm not happy about what we're leaving you with. It's sort of like we had this huge dinner at a restaurant. We sort of skipped out on the bill and left it for you. Everything that's written about millennials is about wanting to solve problems, wanting to collaborate, wanting to make the planet a better place. So the nice thing is that is an awesome responsibility that's been put in your laps. That's an awesome charge, and now the task is to step up and do it.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's episode of The Global Current. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and SoundCloud, and be sure to visit us on blogs.shu.edu/globalcurrent. I'm Alex Krause.
And I'm Karina Taylor.
And we'll see you next week.
The Global Current is brought to you by the School of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University. Our executive producer is Bill Gola. Our co-executive producers are Daniel Garay and Alicia Charabali. Our technical producer is Evan Doolittle. Our news and analysis editors are Gabriela Taveras and Catherine Beebe. The theme song is Acid Jazz by Kevin MacLeod. This has been The Global Current on WSOU, Seton Hall's Pirate Radio.